to Share, a podcast about working better together in our families, friendships, at work, and in the world. I'm Wynne and in this episode, I'm with marketing and PR pro Eric Knudson, and we're talking about how to share humor. Humor is such an effective tool for winning friends and influencing people. But making sure you have the right audience, timing, and content is hard. So Eric breaks down the common elements of humor, like shared experiences, punching up to people in power, and tender moments when we don't know whether to laugh or cry. He tells some great stories about using humor at work and when it was helpful, and the few moments that fell flat. We talk about American presidential humor and how different leaders have adopted their own styles. Eric is a dear friend and influencer of my kids' sense of humor. So we talk about humor develops, and he gives some tips for how we can all share our humor. This is a great episode filled with funny stories that will have you laughing and thinking about how you can share laughter. I know you'll love it. Hi, Eric.
Hi, Wynne. How are you?
I'm good. And I'm excited to talk to you about humor.
I'm excited to be here.
Okay, so in addition to being voted by my kids as the funniest person that they know, you've also been a PR and marketing professional for 30 years. You've worked across lots of industries, insurance, senior living, food and beverage. I mean, so many. I can't wait to talk about some of those stories. But can we start by, could you share what humor is?
I can't. And I think that's one of the things that makes humor so great is because it's everybody defines it differently, and some people find things funny and other people don't, and we all sort of recognize it, but it's not something that's easily defined.
Okay.
Makes it so great.
Well, I think that there's two things that are going to come up in this conversation because they come up in most conversations with you, which is soccer and the English. So can we start is there any tie between humor and soccer?
Yes, so it is
Okay.
true that, as you know me, that I am geeky about a lot of things, and soccer and English humor are at the top of the list. But yes, my kind of universal theory on humor is that it's very much like soccer in the sense that one of the things that I think is so great about soccer is that there's so many different ways to be successful. And like you can have soccer players that are 5'4" and others that are like 6'5", and teams that have the ball all the time and other teams that don't want to have the ball ever. And I think humor is sort of the same way. Like you can have, like if you look at stand-up comedy, say, you can have comedians like, I don't know, Woody Allen or somebody who talks all the time, and other comedians who barely talk at all. And there's smart humor and stupid humor, and again, it's always changing and it's always different.
I like that. I love that analogy. I just wish that, some the players should wear numbers so that I could track them, because that's how I track the soccer players is, number 10 is usually the forward, and then I.
Right, exactly.
Right. Well, so given that variability, does everyone have a sense of humor?
I think everyone thinks they have a sense of humor, and some people have better than others. And certainly I think that there are people, I would say that not everyone generates a lot of humor, but because I know people who have a sense of humor and they recognize it and appreciate it, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're cracking jokes or being funny themselves. And then, I'm sure you've certainly met people who think they are much funnier than they actually are. I think there's very few people who are like philosophically opposed to humor at all levels. Again, it may be disagreements on what's funny or when humor is appropriate or not appropriate, but I think that not very many people are anti-humor.
Yeah, that's true. But what's funny is odd is that my brother and I, like, we think that we're really funny. Like,
Yeah,
when he says something funny, like, I laugh hardest because there's
right.
something that's shared about that. And whether it's the family of origin or I don't know what it is, but we can really get each other going in a way that, it just doesn't happen. So, can humor be taught?
I think so, but I think it can certainly be learned. I mean,
Hmm.
and that I think is sort of kind of what you were just saying with your brother. I mean, like most people sort of that's their kind of humor legs, if you will,
Hmm.
come from their family,
Hmm.
and certainly families have different senses of humor and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but I think a big part of humor is shared experiences, and
Mm.
certainly you get those from your family because
Hmm.
they're around you all the time, whether you want them to be or not,
Right.
so yeah, and I think it's it's interesting when people, like I think about sort of like going away to college or something like that, when you're put in a new situation and suddenly you're exposed to all this new kinds of humor that maybe is really different than what you grew up with
Right.
or the kind of humor that you had in high school, and that's always really interesting, I think.
Right, right. Because if you grew up with very cerebral humor and, the pranks and those antics probably seem kind of foreign or new.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah. So, what are some of the basic elements that you think of when you think of humor?
I mean, we touched on it already, but I think
Hmm.
shared experience is a big part of it. I mean, I think that's the reason stand-up comics are always gonna have material about, you know, airlines and shopping at 7-Eleven and weird things their kids did or their
Hmm.
pets or whatever, because almost everybody can relate to that.
Right.
Like I have this great memory of a buddy of mine who was a stand-up comic, and I spent a couple of days sort of shadowing him at some events that he did. And I can remember this one day where at lunchtime he had been hired to do a gig for a bunch of McDonald's franchisees, and he had sort of 10 or 15 minutes of kind of standard stand-up comic jokes that kind of would go for anybody. But what made him so successful was that he actually, after he got this gig, went and hung out at a McDonald's for an afternoon and like talked to the people that worked there. So like he actually had some
Hmm.
jokes about like changing the oil in the French fry machine and how,
Mm.
you're supposed to put in 5 gallons of oil, but it comes in a 6 gallon bottle, or, like stuff like that, which, on the face of it, it's not that funny, but to this group, it was hysterical because they all lived that kind of, and it
Right.
just like he really dialed in on the shared experience of this group,
Yeah.
and they loved him.
Yeah.
So he did
Well,
that Friday at lunchtime, and then Friday night he was at a gig in the basement of a fraternity house at the UW. Completely different audience, and
hmm.
his material was completely different.
Huh.
But he did the same thing in the, 20 minutes or so before he went on. He had talked to some people that were there at the party. And so, like, he opened up with a joke about the sorority house across the street. And just again, like, he just tailored it. And then he went into kind of his usual stuff. But,
Right.
like, his usual stuff for that audience was different because they were young and drunk
Hmm.
and stupid and very different than the lunchtime crowd.
Right. And that makes me laugh because as a tech person, there's jokes that will work for, the people that I work with. Like,
Right.
for anybody that supported somebody in the tech support, say, "Oh yeah, I helped them. The ONOFF selector was in the wrong position."
Right. That is
Right? That would lay
hysterical.
them
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So here's a chance for me to plug another British humor show, but
Yeah.
there's a show called the IT Crowd. I don't know if
Mm.
you've ever seen that, but a lot of it, same kind of thing. I mean,
Right.
it came out a long time ago, but it was a lot of sort of tech kind of jokes, and when I watch it, I don't get a lot of it, but I know people
Right.
that do. Yeah.
Right. So we got shared experience. What are some other basic
Um,
elements?
I mean, I think that everybody loves to make fun of the people in
Mm.
charge,
Punching
and
up.
yeah, yeah, and I think that, certainly in places where, you know, maybe there isn't as much freedom of speech, or like that's a coping mechanism, sort of
Mm-hmm.
it's like you can make fun of dear leader or whoever. You might have to be careful about how you do that, but clearly
Yeah.
everybody likes.
Yeah. My dad used to have a Putin joke that he liked to tell. Putin, and this was when Medvedev was president of Russia,
Hmm.
and Putin was not in charge. So Putin and Medvedev go into a restaurant, and the waitress asks what they want, and Putin says, "Well, I'll have the meat and the potatoes." And she says, "And what? And the vegetable?" And Putin says, "He'll have the same."
Right, exactly,
Right.
exactly, because that was the deal, that he was nominally the president.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Right. Right.
yeah.
That's a good one. Anything else that I
Well,
mean,
I think, I mean, there's, lots of people have made the connection between sort of tragedy and comedy, and the
right.
the idea that if we weren't laughing, we'd be
Mm-hmm.
crying.
Mm-hmm.
And I promise you, I'm not going to talk about British comedians in every single one of my answers, but I still very vividly remember John Cleese, who is one of the members of Monty Python, when Graham Chapman died. So
Mm-hmm.
so at his funeral, so not
Tell
not a,
me who Graham Chapman.
he was also one of the founding
Okay.
members of Monty Python.
Okay.
So it's a funeral, and everyone's wondering, like, are they going to tell jokes? Like, how is this going to go? And John Cleese gets up there, and he obviously, he's dressed in a dark suit and tie, and he gets up there, and the first thing he says is, you know, I never really liked him that much. And then he went on and did this amazing tribute, in which on the surface he was complaining about him the whole time, but it was really showing what a wonderful person he was. I mean, it was just absolutely
Right.
brilliant. And I can remember at my dad's memorial service, where I was kind of like the MC, if you will, and was the first person that spoke, and like was really unsure, like, can I start with a joke?
Mhm.
Like, I felt like I wanted to, and I finally decided that yes, I could, and I did. It was like all of the tension sort of went out of the room,
Mhm. Mhm.
and it sort of was like, okay, this is really a celebration, and
Right.
it kind of sort of set the tone for the whole thing. And
Yeah.
and other people who spoke were able to share their humor as well. And so I think even in times when maybe humor isn't expected,
Yeah.
it can still be very powerful.
And there's a lot of comedians who suffered from depression and
Yeah,
can joke about that.
yeah, and certainly, I mean, the idea of whether it's bad things that have happened to you, or the
Hmm.
idea of no matter how bad it is, somebody's got it worse. Like,
Right.
those are super common elements in comedy and
Right.
humor, for sure.
I was talking with my kids, and maybe they were a little bit younger, maybe they were 4 and 8. And I was saying that, sometimes people who struggle with sadness can be very funny. And they turned it around. And so they met somebody that was funny, and they were like, I hope he's not sad. I was like, well, that was funny.
Well, yeah, and I have to say that there are many joys of hanging out with your kids, but sort of watching their sense of humors develop
Mm,
is certainly one of them. And
yeah.
I think they're they're 5 and 9 now, so they're getting more sophisticated. And while they still laugh at America's Home Videos and dad's getting hit in the crotch over and over again, because
Yeah.
that's been a ratings winner for 30 years or whatever.
Right.
But now it's like they're starting to sort of realize, to kind of discover wordplay, and how,
Mhm.
it's like, oh, these words kind of sound alike, but they mean different things. And if you switch them around, that can be funny
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
sarcasm and all that other
Yes.
stuff. And it's so yes, you're like, yes, yes,
Yes.
definitely the sarcasm.
Right, right.
Right. Please
Yeah.
stop with the humor development on the sarcasm.
Right.
But yeah, but just all of that is so fun to
Hmm.
see.
It is pretty funny. And it reminds me of a few weeks ago when Miss O was gone for a weekend and, she doesn't have a phone. You know, I hadn't gotten a status report on it. I didn't know what she was doing, but she was traveling for her musical on buses, 3, 4 hours away. And you'd stop by and you drew a picture for her when she returned, and you drawn a picture of a bus, and on the picture that you drew, they were singing 99 bottles of beer on the wall, right?
As one does on a bus.
Right, right.
Right.
And of course we thought that was funny. And then the funniest part was she came home and she stood at the counter and looked at that for the longest time and then turned to me and said, "How did Eric know he's saying 99 bottles of beer on the wall?"
Well, being a psychic can also be very funny.
That also is true.
Right, right.
All right. So you've mentioned a lot of Brits. Do you
Yes.
think that humor is different in different cultures? And
Ab-
why do you like British humor so much?
Absolutely. I mean, in the same way that sort of, the humor that you learn from your
Yeah,
family or from your kind of foundational experiences is different, that it's different by
right.
culture. And, I grew up watching 70s British comedy shows on PBS in the
Yeah.
basement and often didn't understand them, but like I loved Monty Python and things like that. And I feel like Monty Python is like no one is lukewarm about Monty Python. Like you either love Monty Python or you just don't get it. Like
Right.
like people are just like, what is the fuss about? I don't get it. And I think, and again, I'm generalizing, but I think British humor tends to be a little I don't know, there's more kind of wordplay and language puns and it's more clever, if you will, or witty
Right.
as opposed to and I think it's sort of often in British humor, it's smart people being silly, which
Hmm.
which is always entertaining, or at least it
Right.
is for me. Like the guys in Monty Python, many of them like studied philosophy at Oxford and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
They're clearly people that are very smart. They know history and things like that, and yet they can do these sort of ridiculous things. And again, like I love it. Some people just don't get it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, my neighbors that lived in the neighborhood for 3 years were from England. You dubbed them the Duke and Duchess of Green Lake, which was
Yes.
perfect. But everything they said just sounded better.
Yes, right. And like I wonder, are there like families in England who enjoy watching like comedians from America with the Southern accent or something like that? Like
Maybe.
like I don't know. I
Yeah.
mean, yes, I mean sort of the
Yeah.
newness. Yeah, and clearly, that's sort of the running joke is that English actors always sound smarter than they actually are because of the accent.
Right. Right. Do you think it's harder to share humor now than it was when you were watching those 1970s PBS?
I think in many ways it is. I mean that again, that culture doesn't stay in one place, and times were different in the 70s, and I think that some of those changes are good things. But I feel like today we're just so siloed and
Mm-hmm.
and and like it's so easy to not encounter people who think differently than you because you can watch the YouTube channels of the
Mm-hmm.
people who think like you and all that. So like the idea that humor is kind of this thing that brings us all together. Like I think there are some people, not everyone, but just who aren't as interested in being all together. Like they want to be with the people on their team or their
Mm-hmm.
tribe. And like I think about sort of, how the media landscape, for example, has changed. Like back in the day, people watched Johnny Carson because there wasn't a whole lot of choices,
Mm-hmm.
and he was sort of the comedian and talk show host for everybody. And so
Right.
like, yeah, he would tell some jokes about Democrats, but then he'd also tell some jokes about Republicans, like, because
Hmm.
both Democrats and Republicans were watching, kind
Hmm.
of, And I think today you don't see that quite as much,
Hmm.
and again, it's kind of audiences are more self-selecting, and they kind of humor, instead of inviting people in, it can be used to kind of keep people out,
Yeah.
or it can be
Right.
more aggressive. But
You know, I've,
I think the flip side of that is, and again, I'm generalizing, some younger people today are less comfortable with the idea of humor at someone else's expense. And that's good,
hmm
because, one of the things I am constantly doing with your kids is trying to get them to watch movies that I liked when I was a kid. And usually I fail miserably, but
hmm
like, we've had this experience where like we'll go back and watch a movie from the 80s, and it doesn't always age that well.
hmm
Like some of the jokes, it's like, oh, yeah, like back then it was okay to make jokes about people because they were gay or
hmm
Asian or overweight,
Right.
and like that's clearly not okay. And so it's good that we've progressed in that way. But I
Right.
think sometimes it can go to the other extreme where people are just uncomfortable with being a little bit uncomfortable,
Hmm.
or and so that like they're not they're not willing to sort of have humor at anyone's expense ever.
hmm Well, I thought about this because, I've said this many times. I inherited my dad's humor cards
Ah,
that he used in sermons, and they're really gentle.
yes,
It's
for sure.
very gentle humor, and a lot of it is, shared experience. Some of them, like he had some favorite quips, like, why does a 2 pound box of chocolate make me gain 5 pounds?
Right, right,
Or stupidity got us into this mess. Why can't it get us out of it? Right?
right, right,
He had this very it was gentle. It wasn't, as you said, in at anybody's expense, or if it was about the Presbyterians because he was, often talking to a crowd of Presbyterians.
right, right,
Hmm.
right. And that certainly is a super common thing of like, if you're gonna make fun of someone, it's okay if
Yeah,
it's your own team, or the idea that sort of if you're gonna make fun of everyone, that's okay.
yeah,
So
right.
like here's another British comedian that I like, but I don't know if you remember when Ricky Gervais hosted the Oscars a few times,
Hmm.
and he made people so uncomfortable because he like really took some shots at people in the room, that
Hmm.
were but he did it for everybody kind of. And so
Yeah,
it, like the first time he did it, people were kind of freaked out, and then it sort of became like, oh, you've arrived when Ricky Gervais makes fun of you, kind of.
yeah,
But you could tell like people, they're sitting there knowing that like
yeah,
half a dozen people in this room are gonna get ripped on, and
yeah,
it might be me. And you could tell people were a little
yeah,
uncomfortable,
right.
and again, like that, being a little bit uncomfortable is often part of humor.
Well, before we started recording, we were talking about political humor, and
Which I
you know,
love. And I think, it's always fascinating to me, like how, for example, presidents use humor, because I mean, they're sort of, you know, the most visible American in many ways. And like different presidents have done it very differently. I mean, like I think about, Joe Biden was sort of dad jokes or grandpa
hmm
jokes, and very much sort of part of his persona as America's grandpa, kind of.
hmm hmm
Or you think back to like Bill Clinton, who was sort of the empath in chief, and like he was really good at sort of finding those shared experiences. And then I look at like Hillary Clinton, who everyone who knows her well says she has a really great sense of humor. Like when she's been on Saturday Night Live and stuff, like she's been really funny, but she really struggled how to use humor kind of as a candidate.
right,
And like that never became sort of part of her
yeah,
persona.
And maybe for women that is harder.
That's
Women
great.
who are trying to be in charge.
I agree with that,
Yeah.
and I think for someone like Hillary, who, her deal was like she's basically done this job already. She was sort of
Yeah.
co-president, she was Secretary of State. She's been in the room
Right.
when they were taking out someone. Um, and
Yeah.
and that uh like that, if that's kind of the image that you're trying to convey, that you're experienced and
Hmm.
tough enough to do this job,
Yeah.
yeah, how then, do you use humor, and can you use self-depreciating humor
Yeah.
if that's the message that you're
Yeah.
trying to convey? And I think Kamala Harris struggled with that too. And I
Hmm.
think you're right. I think it's
Hmm.
much more challenging
Right.
for women candidates. And
George W. had an interesting sense of humor.
yeah, and like I think a great example of, someone who, like, I didn't agree with much of anything that he did politically, but he was really good at sort of the self-depreciating humor,
Hmm.
and like remember some of the jokes that he made. And granted, he's not coming up with these jokes on his own, but like at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, like, he made jokes about his own inability to form sentences and stuff, and like it
Yeah.
really humanized him, and
Hmm.
sort of the idea of like, yeah, I might not agree with him, but I bet he'd be fun to have a beer with, kind of.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think as an ex-president, he's sort of leaned into that kind of, and
Right.
like I think if you see him, you've probably seen some clips of like how he and Michelle Obama like really have this
Hmm.
genuine friendship and
Right.
jokes and like humor and stuff. Yeah.
So you've had a long career in, corporate communications, marketing, PR. Do you think sharing humor was helpful at work for you?
Absolutely. I,
Mm.
I think that back to early in my career, where it wasn't my first job, but it was sort of my second job. So, I was probably in my early to mid-20s, pretty young. I worked at this very conservative insurance company that was sort of conservative in a way that I don't think companies really are
Hmm.
anymore. There was like a dress code, and men had to wear suits and ties, and it was very, like,
And it had a start time and a stop time. I mean, like
yep,
it had a very
eight eight eight
defined,
eight to 4:30, breaks
yeah.
were at 9:30 or 10, and you get a little 15-minute coffee break in the morning and the afternoon, and it was very structured, and
Hmm.
like things like, um there was this unwritten rule, but a rule that was enforced, or if you violated it, you would get dirty looks. That if you were on your floor as a man, you could go around without your suit jacket on. But
Hmm.
if you were going from one floor to another, you would always put your jacket on. Like what? Really? Um, so when shortly after I started there, the CEO retired and a new CEO came in, promoted from within. But, and, this was maybe like the fourth or fifth CEO in the history of the company. So it was a big deal. And somehow I got drafted into sort of like, okay, make him more relatable and use some humor. Like that wasn't the assignment, but that's sort of
Right.
what it ended up being. And he was super interesting because he actually had a good sense of humor, but he just wasn't very comfortable using it, or like you sort of had to remind him, like, yeah, go tell a joke and do this. And so anyway, so I did some things with him, and they were well received, and sort of people liked him, and so I sort of, like, other people on the leadership team were like, hey, I'm giving a speech. Can you take a look at it and stuff? And like, this is not something that would normally have been part of my job. And it actually, like, one, it helped me build some like relationships with these
Hmm.
top guys at the company that probably wouldn't have happened if we hadn't done this. And
Right.
like, I can remember, you're in the elevator and the CEO of the company gets in, and everyone, like, sort of like, kind of freaks out, good morning, sir, and whatever. And like, he would come in and, like, say hi, hey, how's it going? And then people, he'd get out, and people like, who are you? How do you have that kind of relationship with the CEO
Right.
when you're this kind of snotty 23-year-old, And it really did sort of open some doors for me and give me
Yeah.
some opportunities that I don't think I would have got if
Yeah.
I hadn't
Had a sense
kind
of
of
humor.
had this reputation as someone that could help liven up your speech with a joke or two.
Right. Right. That's pretty amazing because I didn't, I've never worked at that company, but it had a reputation for being very serious. But somebody else that we've had on the podcast said, especially from corporate communications, if you start something with "there's donuts in the coffee room,"
Right,
everybody
right.
reads it. And I think humor does the same thing for you, right?
I think so. And I think a lot of people worry too much, like, okay, if I try to share my humor and maybe it doesn't go quite as well, or, maybe I think it's funny, but no one else does. But I think that most of the time people appreciate the effort kind
Hmm.
of, and
Hmm.
and I think that in the corporate world, particularly in, more conservative companies, like people are kind of starved for that, but
Hmm.
they're, and less so today, but like back then, like people really, really, it sort of created this culture and again shared experience that people really appreciated,
Hmm.
and so yeah, I think it really can
Hmm.
be a positive thing.
Has it ever gotten you in trouble?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. And I think that, I was really fortunate in my career in that most of the time I had bosses who pretty quickly recognized that I could take things seriously without being too serious, if that makes sense. And
Hmm.
that they sort of realize that, oh, hey, having some humor around when things get stressful, that's
Hmm.
useful and valuable and stuff. But sometimes, especially like I can remember sometimes if I changed jobs and I was sort of new, like they didn't know me so well. Um, I can remember, for example, I was working at a company and somehow I got drafted to be the Santa Claus at the Christmas party. And this was sort of, again, like, I don't know if Christmas parties like this exist anymore, but like they rented out this like ballroom in a hotel and people got dressed up and drank a lot. And so, again, as Santa Claus, one of the things that I did was read some letters that were supposedly from like the leadership team to
Hmm.
Santa of things that they wanted. And again, sort of leaning into the idea of if you make fun of everybody, it's okay. Like, and the idea was sort of written as if they were children, sort of. So,
Hmm.
like, Susie wants an easy bake oven because she likes to have her fingers in as many pies as possible. Kind of,
Okay. Yeah.
and like one of the guys was sort of known on the leadership team was known for being a saxophone player, and like he wanted a new saxophone, but everybody says I'm already good at blowing my own horn.
Right.
And everybody thought it was hilarious except one person. And I had to sort of explain to her, like this was not, sort of here's
Right.
here's kind of the thinking and stuff, and she came around to it, and like, but like I was a little worried at first that like
Yeah.
I didn't think I was going to get fired, but I thought maybe I was going to get in trouble.
Yeah, right, right. That reminds me of a story that you tell my kids, I think probably about every Christmas, is when you had to play Santa Claus in high school because your mom drafted you for something.
Well, yes, when I was growing up, we had this weird kind of setup in the neighborhood where you could have Santa Claus come to your Christmas party if you
Mm,
made a donation to Children's Hospital.
right.
And somehow my mom was put in charge of the North Pole. So when I was old enough to drive, I would drive Santa, and then eventually somebody got sick and I had to be Santa. And
Didn't somebody have a gift that you objected to?
Yes, that is true. Yes, and sort of so what Santa would frequently do is the kids would come in and sit
Yeah.
on Santa's lap, and there'd be a bag of gifts, and you'd say, "Here, this is for Wynne, and this is
Yeah.
for Eric, and this is whoever." And one of the gifts was a snake. Yeah, which and I would think, if there was a snake in the box, you would tell that to Santa. So
Yes, so you
that
should let Santa know about that.
yes, right, because there are no snakes in the North Pole. Santa
Santa
is
needs a heads up.
Yes, he does. So yeah, so there was this kind of snotty preteen boy sitting on my lap, and he had a snake, and
Oh.
yeah, it was really pretty awful, and I had to really control myself for not just going ah! and pushing them both to the floor and
Exactly.
running
Because
away.
then there would be a snake loose as you
Right.
did that. Right. Okay, last question.
Okay.
Any tips for people who want to share more humor?
Uh, I think people often think of having a sense of humor or sharing humor is like a skill,
Yeah.
and it can be, but I think it's also a muscle, like you have to exercise it and try it. And kind of like what I said earlier, it's like, don't worry so much about what people are going to think. And obviously you need to read the room a little bit and probably shouldn't be making jokes at funerals, things like
Yeah.
that. But yeah, I think that sort of being a little bit more relaxed about the idea of sharing humor will help a lot. And I think, one of the beauties of the times we live in is that, everybody's got an unlimited library of humor in the palm of their hand all the time. And that, there's all kinds of great humor on YouTube or TikTok
Right.
or whatever, wherever you spend your time. And,
Yeah.
you can watch that and learn from that.
Timing
Yeah.
and all those things. And I like what you said about a muscle because especially with timing, practicing it helps.
Yeah, for sure. And I recommend having a 5-year-old and a 9-year-old because I think that's sort of the beauty is like your kids are at the perfect age for appreciating my sense of humor. And one day soon they will outgrow it and be more sophisticated. And I guess the last thing I would say is sort of looking for opportunities to use humor to kind of invite people in, and again, sort of focusing on those shared experiences.
Bringing it together. I love it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your humor and your time with us. So grateful.
It was my pleasure.
I hope you're not saying that to be funny.
No, I would never joke about that.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening. Our music was written for us by the incredible duo of Jack Campora and Rob Koenig. For show notes and more great inspiration, see avitiva.com, avitiva.com.